Now what I want to talk about is designing a breeding program. You've got your sheep or goats, and now you need to figure out how you're going to breed them, what kind of traits and characteristics that you're going to choose your breeding stock for to design your program. Setting up a breeding program can be done. It can be designed in 4 steps. Step 1 is setting goals. Step 2 is choosing and weighing the traits of the animals. Step 3 is determining what kind of measurements you're going to need to evaluate your breeding program. And then step 4 is devising a strategy for selecting parents. Setting goals helps to give a sense of direction for your program. They must be laid out carefully. Typically, these are determined by your customer base and should reflect resource availability, producer's interest, promotional styles and abilities, and a realistic evaluation of present and future markets. When you're looking at and weighing the traits of your flock, you must be consistent with your goals. Don't take an inferior animal because you have grown fond of them. That's not going to do anything to help your actual overall program. Producer should evaluate current flock or herd for his or her selected traits of emphasis. So if you've gone out and you've bought your flock, but you really didn't have a breeding program in mind at the time, this would be a good time to go through and evaluate the flock and select the ones that definitely fit the traits that you have, and then look at culling the rest of them. That way you start out with a flock that meets your program goals. Also, as you're going through and looking at the different traits, be aware of the breed strengths and their weaknesses. Definitely want to maintain the strengths of that breed. If you're doing crossbreeds, then you can look at the strengths from both breeds that you're looking at. But again, you also got to pay attention to their weaknesses. And after carefully determining how much emphasis you want to place on each selected trait, then you can go through and start your breeding stock selection. So this is probably one of the important steps in a program, and one that probably gets derailed the most is paying attention to the traits that you want. Because typically when we're out buying the animals, rather than looking at their performance data and their estimated breeding values if they have them, we get caught up in the actual visual appraisal of the animal, and that animal looks great, it looks top notch, but it could have some of the worst estimated breeding values out there and do more harm to your program for your goals than they do good. So pay attention in here and don't let your emotions outweigh cold hard facts. Once you've determined what traits that you're wanting to breed for, you need a way to measure the animals. This helps, and measurements have to be taken in order to obtain useful and accurate information. You need a uniform measuring system and a well-organized record keeping. If you fail to have either of these, you might make some progress, but you're probably not going to make the type of progress that you really should be. And so examples on this, if your market niche is replacement sires, which are, that's a market. If you decide that's what you want to raise for, by all means, go for it. Just make sure that you understand what your customers are going to be wanting out of those sires. If you go out and breed animals that are low weight gainers and take longer to mature, if you're selling those sires to somebody that, say, is running a commercial flock and they're trying to get their offspring up to market weights as fast as possible, because the less input they have to put into them, that means more money in their pocket, then that type of sire is probably not going to work for them. So that's something you have to be careful in and pay attention to, is what your market is going to want or need. So with selecting parents, sire selection, a sire can produce consistently more offspring than a female. And so it becomes a very important selection within your breeding program. And by the same token, you also have to remember that the sire only represents half of the genetic potential of the offspring. But depending upon what kind of program you're running and what your market is, the sire plays a big role in what you are able to produce for your customers. Your female selection. Typically on your females, you're going to want a well-defined mix of all traits. If you go and you select a lot of females that are, say, super high, great carcass merit traits, but they are maybe weak in the maternal traits, typically rams are not going to help in this situation. And females that end up in this kind of a situation are probably results from programs that typically only paid attention to and cared about 1 to 2, maybe a very small handful of traits. And so they super concentrated between their males and females on those traits, which can be a detriment in the long run. The other thing is you want to pay special emphasis to the traits that will help achieve previous set goals. You always want to consider the good traits of both parents when making your selection, and always select sires and dams which will complement each other well. Some of the ways that you can go about selecting your sires and females. One, you can do a visual appraisal of them. If you have registered stock, typically they have pedigrees, and you can go back and research the pedigree history to find out where or how and who performed well in what areas. And then also, if the flock that you're buying from, if they've taken the time to track the estimated breeding values for the sheep and goats. If you're dealing with other livestock, it's usually referred to as expected progeny differences, or EPDs. This is a well-researched and defined set of traits that typically have some kind of visual appraisal that we can do to help assess. But if we're actually tracking the information, then we can use that to determine what the offspring will potentially be doing for us. Part of your visual selection, sometimes referred to as phenotype. It's based on appearance and performance. Traits to consider is correctness of feet and legs, in other words, your conformation, your muscle, the masculinity when selecting males, and the femininity when selecting females. You want to choose animals based on ideal properties for an animal. it helps to know the breed standard to make sure that you are selecting breeding stock that follows and adheres to the breed standards. For your registered animals, or the ones that do keep track of the pedigree of their animals, you do find some commercial producers that keep really good records, and they can tell you their pedigree going back for as long as they've had them. But typically the pedigree is the record of the animal's ancestry. It can be related to genotype, and it looks at desirable traits from related ancestors of animals for breeding purposes. Performance records. These differ from your EPDs and EBVs in that they track the individual actual weights and measurements taken at various times in the animal's life. Some of the performance data may be incorporated into some of the EPDs and EBVs, but it's something that you can use, especially if you're looking at weight gain, for selecting your individual breeding stock. Some of the examples of performance records include weaning weight, yearling weight, days of 250, and the average daily gain. So, EPDs, when you're looking at those, and or EBVs, why would you want to use those? They have and track a lot of the economically important traits that cannot be determined by visual appraisal alone. Using the EBVs is a proven method of accurately predicting if an animal will pass on important traits such as growth rate, reproductive proficiency, carcass quality, wool quality, and parasite resistance. The National Sheep Improvement Program tracks sheep and goats. So if you're looking for breeders that have stock enrolled in this program and have EBVs available, you can go through the National Sheep Improvement Program to find that. So when you're looking at EBVs, you're like, well, how should I use these things? Well, they begin with on-farm production data that is converted to actionable genetic information. So your performance data is adjusted for variables that are not related to genetics, such as your management techniques. Estimated breeding values are calculated on the performance of the individual animal, related animals in the same flock, and related animals in other flocks. If you use the National Sheep Improvement Program, they group certain EBV traits together to create indexes that are particularly useful tools for selecting breeding stock suited to particular situations. And an example of that is like your Western Range Index for a lot of your producers that are out west, because of the difference in the type of growing conditions and environment that the sheep and goats will be in. And you also have indexes for your wool production, and it's designed to help improve the profitability of the flocks raised on the grasslands in the U.S., and that's also going back to your Western Range Index. Generally, like I said, the traits, you want to try to get balanced overall, but you may need to improve on some traits because you may have a couple of your traits from the whole flock that are on the lower side. And so when you're out looking for a sire, you may want to find an animal that's relatively well balanced, but maybe is higher in those traits that are generally low in your flock to help it raise your overall flock average.